Okay. Um, the other day, I did a video lecture over the Vietnam War, Chapter 22, Section 1. And we just talked about the causes of the Vietnam War from the three different perspectives: the French perspective, the Vietnamese perspective, and the American perspective. And we went through several events that brought America deeper into the war, all the way up to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution essentially gave President Johnson a blank check to send troops uh, to Vietnam and to try to defend South Vietnam from the North Vietnamese who were communists. Um, this is the first time that there are combat troops from America. And what I would like to run through today is essentially the Vietnam War from 1964 up to 1968, which is the turning point in the war. So I'm going to click over and show you the textbook here. And I'm not going to read all of this, but I'll give you some highlights. In section 2, it says U.S. involvement and escalation. From 1964, let's see if I can make this larger. From 1964 until 1968, American involvement continues to increase. That's why we call this the period of escalation. By 1968, there will be over 500,000 American troops, which when you consider when President Kennedy dies, we have 16,000. That means in about 5 years, we go from 16,000 to 500,000 troops. That's what we call escalation. The belief was that if we put enough firepower, enough soldiers, enough bombs into the effort, that there was no way that North Vietnam could overcome South Vietnam. There was no way that communism could spread if we put all of our firepower into it. The problem is the Vietnamese, specifically the North Vietnamese, they didn't have to win. They just had to keep the war going until America got tired. They have what's called the defensive war advantage, where we have to occupy and change their minds. They just have to wear us out. So even if we won every battle, as long as the North Vietnamese kept coming, eventually they believed that America's resolve would fade. General Westmoreland, he was the leader of the American Army, and he was the one who kept asking for more soldiers. There's that number, 500,000. Part of the reason that Vietnam was such a hard fight is because of the terrain. It was jungle, it was wet, there were underground tunnels and booby traps. It was incredibly difficult conditions. A frustrating war of attrition, a battle for hearts and minds. This is what it's talking about as far as can the North Vietnamese and the communist will outlast the American will. And even if the American president and the American military have the will, what about the American public? Eventually, by the time we get to 1967 or 68, there is a sinking morale, that people are losing belief in the cause. Part of the reason that people began to lose belief has to do with the media and the way the war was portrayed. Vietnam is sometimes called a living room war because it's really the first war that plays out on TV. You know, if you think back to the Civil War, that was a newspaper war. If you think back to maybe even World War II, that was largely a radio war. But for Vietnam, this war, you can actually bring back video footage, and people are seeing the fighting and the devastating conditions on their TVs, on the news at night. When people are killed, they're seeing American soldiers come home in body bags, and it changes people's emotions. For a while, the American government was using something called the body count, where they would stress how many Vietnamese soldiers we were killing. And the idea was a high body count was to build confidence in the war. But eventually, no matter how many North Vietnamese enemy we killed, the body count of Americans coming home got to people. There becomes a credibility gap. People wondered if they could believe what the government was telling us. The government was saying that the war was going well and that victory was just around the corner, but the war kept seeming to go on. And this led to what was called a credibility gap. This chapter here, or this section 3, is a nation divided. You need to be familiar with the terms hawks and doves. A hawk was somebody who was in favor of the war, and a dove was somebody who was against the war. A dove wanted peace. At the heart of the peace movement, a lot of times was students. Maybe more so than a conservative older crowd, became disillusioned with the war. Some of this revolved around the draft. I had several students in their homework tell me that they didn't like the way the video sometimes said that soldiers were forced to go to war because of the draft. And some of you referenced family members who served, and family members that served should be proud of that, and that they were willing to go and serve our country in that way. But there were some people in America that felt like they were being forced because of the draft, and that's a sensitive subject, but it crosses both sides. Some people very much believed in the cause, and other people, young people, were being drafted and didn't want to go. That's why there was such a large resistance to the draft by some groups. Some people felt that the Vietnam War draft was manipulative, that it targeted working class. Essentially, if you were wealthier, you could get out of the draft by going to college or by having a connection with a doctor or some other type of exemption connection. However, if you were poor, often African American, if you weren't able to go to college, then you weren't able to get out of the draft. And that's where some of those people would have said the draft was forcing them to the war. One interesting thing about that is you could be drafted to go to the war once you were 18 years old, but you couldn't vote for president until you were 21. That's why by the end of the Vietnam War, there's going to be something called the 26th Amendment that lowers the voting age from 21 to 18, because people said if you're old enough to fight and to serve in a war, you also should be old enough to vote for the president who sends you there. Sorry, I'm getting a text. Here's what I was talking about, the war divides, doves and hawks. Johnson remains determined. By 1967 and heading into 1968, President Johnson still was believing that America could win the Vietnam War and that victory was just around the corner. But 1968 was an election year. You guys watched a video on it, and 1968 is one of the craziest years in American history. It really is a turning point in our history, but also in the Vietnam War. The first thing you need to know about is the Tet Offensive. If you're going to know one battle in the Vietnam War, you need to know the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a battle by North Vietnam where they snuck through Laos and Cambodia and then invaded South Vietnam in multiple places and did a series of surprise attacks from the end of January to the end of February. This was during a Vietnamese holiday called Tet. That's why it's called the Tet Offensive. Now, eventually, America and the South Vietnamese army win those battles. These are not victories for the North. They were surprise attacks, but we overcame them and won the battles. So in a technical sense, America and the South Vietnamese won the Tet Offensive. However, from a psychological and a political standpoint, the Tet Offensive really changes public opinion. People, that idea of a credibility gap, they said, if we were so close to winning, how did the North pull off such a surprise? And the war became more and more unpopular. So much so, Lyndon Johnson, seen here kind of somber, decides not to run for re-election, which is crazy to think about. In the middle of a war, the president who is leading our country says, I'm going to step down and not seek re-election. He really was defeated. Protesters used to stand outside the White House and say, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The weight of the war, the cost of the war was taking a toll, and he decides not to run for re-election. I won't rehash all of this chapter because hopefully you watched the video, but all kinds of people step up to run for president. Robert Kennedy was a peace advocate. He ended up getting assassinated. Eugene McCarthy was anti-war, but he lost popularity. By the time you get to the end of 1968, the presidential race turns into Humphrey versus Richard Nixon. And both Humphrey and Nixon are more conservative and pledge to keep the war going. Ultimately, Richard Nixon is going to win the war, win the presidency. People voted for him, known as the silent majority. In other words, they weren't the radicals that were out there protesting the war and dodging the draft, but they believed that if America stuck with it, that we could win the war. And so Nixon, as our new president, will navigate the last 4 years of the Vietnam War. Thanks for listening.